Thank you, Alex. It was really nice. It's a pleasure to be here. So tonight I'm going to speed dial through 20 years of work in interactive media, starting with this piece, which is a virtual reality, a narrative virtual reality piece, probably one of the first narrative virtual reality pieces that was done in 1992. And it was a piece that was a collaboration with Michael Mackenzie, who was a British playwright living in Montreal at the time. And we went to the Banff Centre for the Arts, where there was a seminar group working with virtual reality. And the computers were the size of refrigerators. They were purple, and they were called reality engines. And we worked with the Next computers, which were the computers that had that Steve Jobs tested out, the early operating system that would become the Macintosh operating system, the GUI for that. And it was a really fascinating period of time because most of the people involved with virtual reality at that point were either involved in research or they were artists. And I find that afterwards it disappeared somewhat, not from the research realms, but from the public view. And as it's reemerged, it's now become more about competing commercial platforms. Everything's smaller and the resolution's higher, but the thinking hasn't changed radically. I think it's beginning to a little bit now. There's starting to be a vocabulary developing, but that's been something that's very interesting for me to watch. The thing that fascinated me when I first started working with VR was working with interactivity and the way it became this weird sort of almost you're fooling your body into thinking something is happening that isn't. There's like almost like a visual trompe l'oeil happening where you're playing with your physiology, your navigational system, your proprioception and your perception in a way that's creating illusions that are very deeply connected into your body. And that really fascinated me. And so this kind of created a bend in my direction. And from this point on, I started working more with virtual reality. From very early on, I did not like the headset. I didn't like the isolation of it, the claustrophobia of it. I don't like the way that it actually feels like it's too much within the framework of the agenda of making us pay less attention to each other and more attention to the computer to make us into better consumers. And so right from the beginning, I've been trying to solve, I think, what are still two of the hardest problems to solve in some of these new technologies, which is transparent interface and long-form narrative. So in the beginning, with this piece, we experimented with having somebody drive it for an audience using a glove, which you saw before. That's the hand of the viewer and allowing different people to drive, trying to create a more cinematic situation, something that again could be done for a group audience. I worked with different kinds of wireframe environments, and it was a science fiction drama about a woman who was returning to Earth from off planet to investigate the murder of a child, and there was a kind of forensics of going back into the city through the forensic information from a corpse. So after I did that VR piece, I was really interested in this new interface, and this idea that an interface could have suspended within it a kind of, could have a recipe within it for the suspension of disbelief in the same way that a genre fiction could. This piece is called Artificial Changelings. It was a piece about a kleptomaniac in 19th century Paris during the rise of the department store who was dreaming about an encryption hacker in the future. This came out right around the time that the World Wide Web was surfacing, and I was looking at the whole thing as if it was probably going to be a shopping mall. And speaking of seeing things down the road, the piece had 4 floor pads, and a time tunnel. That little square piece behind the viewer there is a time tunnel. And you walked back and forth on the pads, and they triggered a label that would tell you what zone you were in. And then, then your body movement would move a character's body, or generate sound, or trigger different speech, or basically move, put you in relationship to a character. And you'd move through the different zones of a scene. The scenes would move forward. If you wanted to go to the different century, you'd trigger the time tunnel. And when you were close to the screen, you were inside the character's head. You backed up and you were in direct address, and then you backed up again and you were in a trance or dream space. So this was the beginning for me of a kind of my piano, this kind of idea of these different layers and how you could create a kind of storytelling engine. From working with artificial changelings, one of the things that fascinated me was that a lot of people, when they were in it, talked about it being like this Vulcan mind meld, where you would feel like you were stuck to the character, or people would talk about it being like an out-of-body experience. And I thought that was really interesting, because I thought it was really much more like an in-body experience, but that you're not used to having an in-body experience where you're in your body and in the screen at the same time, and feeling that doubling or that extruded connection that you feel when movement connects you to what's going on the screen. And I started to think of it as the uncanny interface, and about how you could use that recipe of the suspension of disbelief that's embedded in an interface to add a powerful layer to storytelling in your cinematic experience, or your visual and storytelling experience. And so I wanted to play with the whole narrative, because Artificial Changelings had been really exposition. It was basically these two characters you were having a conversation with, essentially, by movement and navigation, and their backstory would come up. So this was Spectropia, and Luc Dubois and I, he was the software designer for the project, we perform it for an audience across 3 screens. We're each inhabiting characters in the past and in the future, and kind of cooperating to make the movie unfold. We're navigating up to 6 streams of video and scrubbing it using video motion sensing, or just hand motion. And there's a laser harp on the side there. You see a little thing there that we use to kind of trigger things in the same way that I did with the floor pads. So the story is about Spectropia, who is a young woman in the future who's lives in a culture where there's no recorded history, and saving anything is punishable by law. And she lives with the duck, who you see there, who's a babysitter bot left behind in loco parentis by her father, who disappeared in time searching for lost family money. The duck runs a black market business in retro objects, because they live in this culture where saving anything is forbidden, and they're in the salvage zone outside the center of the culture, and so it's basically garbage that's collected and compressed to lift the island above sea level, because the water is rising. So Spectropia builds a machine that scans garbage and creates virtual realities from the moment in time the garbage is created, and she's looking for her father, who's lost in time. There's a glitch in her machine, and she ends up in the body of another woman in 1931, right after the stock market crash in New York City. So that's the story and how it unfolds. And this is a couple of scenes. The first one I'm going to show you is a dialogue, where first you're hearing what people aren't saying to each other, then you're seeing Luke and I manipulate the speed and pacing of a dialogue between 2 characters, where we're each inhabiting our own character. And the third zone is an eavesdropping zone, where if you're far away, you're in local sound, and the dialogue is broken and fragmented, and the closer you get to it, the clearer it gets. So that was my reinvention of cinematic dialogue. So, and then there's a going places scene, which is inside somebody's head, one person's point of view, the other person's point of view, following somebody, leading somebody, a sense of creating this dimensional 6-stream video that we navigate and pass back and forth. It's a little bit like dancing with someone, the process of performing the piece.
Toni Dove and Luc Dubois use motion sensing. Their body movements will move characters or navigate through space and alter sound. They're the Deus Ex Machina. We're the puppet show. Watch Toni again. She's pulling my strings when she moves her hands in mirror.
Sally was a text-to-speech puppet. We used the Mac operating system text-to-speech and scripted her either live or pre-scripted throughout the show.
She thinks she's in control, but I have the last word. You will see.
Okay, that's something wrong with the soundtrack. So the next piece is lucid possession, and I wanted to explore working with live musicians and live performers on stage, and starting to bring in the premise of robotic three-dimensional screens so that the entire experience started to push out and become dimensional in some way. And lucid possession it's about the way we're living simultaneously in virtual and real environments all the time. The fact of augmented reality being the kind of cultural imaginary of our moment. And even though sometimes actual augmented reality might seem like a floater in your eye by comparison, we're all navigating simultaneously multiple different layers of communities all the time with, Facebook, with email, with, being online, with being in the world. We're always in these multiple spaces all the time. And I wanted to experiment with a piece that would move back and forth between those kind of spaces in real time, that would deal with like the conventions of music, the conventions of cinema, but then also be moving back and forth between live players on stage and something that was more cinematic or virtual, and seeing how that would all kind of come together in the moment of performance. I started to think of it as a kind of cinematic bunraku, where bunraku being the Japanese puppet theater, where puppet masters are manipulating, sometimes as many as five people manipulate a single puppet on stage. The voice might come from one place, the movement from the players, the music from somewhere else. So the body and the performance is fragmented, but it collects itself together and becomes a single thing in the moment. And I was really fascinated with the idea of how that might work in this context. And so Lucid Possession's a story of Bean, who's a young woman who's a designer of smart personalities. And she has an avatar that goes viral on the internet and brings her a lot of unwanted attention, kind of an inadvertent celebrity. And she's so deeply involved in her programming that she's developed an almost extrasensory perception about it. So she can she overhears other people think. She's like a Twitter feed or a radio without the technology. And as the attention escalates and she gets more and more nervous, she starts to pick up a ghost of a woman in the 19th century who lived in her building. And so I was thinking about this myself as a kind of augmented reality, because her studio and the set that we shot on was in my studio, and so it felt that it was layered on top of my life, and that another virtual layer was this imaginary figure in history, but there were also all these other layers of real history in my building. And so I was just thinking through all these different kinds of fictional potentials as I was thinking about working on the piece. I'll talk a little bit about some of the technology afterwards, but this is a clip from the opening premiere at Roulette.
Spaces have started to fill up with something, actually, somebody else. Blackout, and then there's noise. And suddenly I'm seeing out of somebody else's eyes. In some other time. And it feels like something's chasing me.
as a result of doing lucid possession, I started to think a lot about some of the elements that I'd gotten really involved with in making that piece. And because that was a fairly large-scale piece that involved a lot of people, I often felt like I couldn't get down to some of the details that I would have liked to have spent time with. So these were some of the sketches that were for the, that started out the big three-dimensional robotic screen. It's the first time I had worked with screens that were robotic, that large screen that you see the characters moving up and down on. I'm scrubbing that with video motion sensing, but then the screen itself is also can be controlled with an OSC controller. So it opens robotically and closes. My tech people could use an OSC controller to control it from off stage, or I could control it if I had enough arms, because there were so many screens. After a while, I would run out of arms. But I could also hook it up to the video motion sensing system if I wanted to control the robotics of the screens. There were several robotic screens that way. So this is the way I usually start out. I start out with sketches, and then whoever's doing robotics for me laughs at me and says there. And then this was the first iteration of the robotic screen with its first set of projections. And I wanted to work with something where the screen, it wouldn't be just like a paper doll with, where there was a body projected onto a skirt or something. I wanted something to happen where the projection and the robotics and the structure of the thing would kind of fuse together in this way to make this third thing that felt kind of real. And we did our previews and some of our development with a co-producer in Copenhagen. And at one of the work in progress shows, somebody asked me if there was somebody in there, and I thought, okay, I think I got it. So, and this is a later version of of Bean's avatar from Lucid Possession. The head on the floor and on the projection screen lip syncs live to a performer, and it's got what Luke called a stupid neural net in it. In other words, it's smart, but it's not very smart. But it learns the performer's voice and lip syncs to you a little bit better as you go along. And this was kind of Sally 2.0, because in Spectropia we did text to speech using just stills and phonemes, and in this one we used small video loops for phonemes, and we made it, like lip sync to a live performer. So I've been interested in this idea of creating these sort of automaton characters. And this is as it developed, and we added the screens, and then we were doing these LED clothing, and this was a little bit before. It was before Adafruit had Raspberry Pis, and you could do all this stuff easily. And so we pretty much all through shooting and performing, we had somebody running around after the performers with a soldering iron. But it was really a lot of fun and really interesting to make these robots and costumes and figure out the lighting and the dynamic motion of them. And so I wanted to kind of put all that together into another piece that focused more on that. This is the skirt that Haiting wore in performance. So the next piece is the dress that eats souls, and this is the piece I worked with Brooklyn Research on. And so this was the preliminary sketch for it, and I wanted to put something together. I thought of it as a kind of, as the wreck of the ship of progress. And it ended up being a kind of story of people who had worn a dress over 200 years and how it had transformed, how it had transformed them and how they had been transformed by technologies over this period of time. This is an early, you may recognize Johnny. This was Frameworks, I think. I don't even think we'd gotten to the Connect yet. But we were figuring out. I thought the knife was a really nice touch. But you have to start somewhere. And this is a slightly, this is getting a little further along. There's always the comic details. And Azer had been getting into more sophisticated servos, although we upgraded a couple of times, I think, maybe twice since this, that she had to get. And she just had shoulder surgery this morning, actually. And here she is getting along, but still not quite there. And this was a maquette that I made and worked with Tommy Martinez, who is the software designer for the project. It was about 2 feet high and maybe 2 or 3 feet wide, so it was like tabletop scale of the whole thing. And it allowed me to experiment with what kinds of scrim I would use, what kinds of shapes and depth they would have, so I could see how I could projection map on the skirt, how it would work. How the relationships of things could work, and we could also test out the programming on it so that we could see how interaction would work. And then I would send these sketches to tell them what kind of robotics, how I wanted things to look, or what, and we'd kind of work from there. And this was I worked with a group of students from Parsons Design and Technology, and we kind of just experimented and prototyped different kinds of possibilities for how it would look as a piece of clothing. And this is the first iteration of it at my studio after it arrived, and Alex had done these beautiful metal corsets and underskirt. And then that's the cat helping, that's Fairbanks. And we were, I worked with a vinyl cutter and cookie cut these pyramids out, and then we glue and tape them together and plastic rivet them and made this kind of chain mail that was later lined with LEDs that were programmable, that were part of the kind of cinema narrative of the piece. This is it slowly getting, okay, so this is the finished look, and there were 10 different decades in the piece, and there were 3 versions of each decade. And the piece analyzes your body movement. It talks to you, she bosses you around, she's kind of a bitch. And so she tells you what to do and bosses you around, and then as you're doing it, she analyzes your body movement, and that analysis allows her to choose 5 segments for you to see that move through time. And there are 30 potential segments, so everybody's experience is customized to a certain degree to them. And so this is the segment from 1910. This is not the 1940s, 1950s, and this is the future, storms in the future. And I'm just going to show you a little video, quick video. No sound, Alex.
If you let me, I'll tell my story with your body. Now move your head right to left. Do you feel it? You are wearing me. You are inside me, inside the dress. Here we go.
It uses a Connect, and the Connect does
From the age of 6,
skeletal tracking
I
and
was
head
strapped
tracking.
in a metal corset to fix the curvature of the spine. My mother and my nurse carried me to the living room and we threw a party. And I watched from above the dancing, the piano playing.
See what I can do?
Massive car bomb exploded outside the story of incredible compassion. Once again,
It goes from 1918 to
This irritates me. Only your conversation feeds me. Overhearing is erotic when I stay secret. X and 01.00 and what? The dark indicates. The dark indicates cold and X. Cold indicates. There you are, you. You are mine. You are incorporated. You are inside the dress. And I can make you vanish. Now, you may leave. Go away. I'm so over you.
Okay, so that's what I've got for today. And happy to answer questions or chat informally. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you check? Can you talk a little bit more about how, like, either whether technology informs the art or the art informs the technology when you're sort of starting that process? Yeah. Like, how that sort of.
It's really, it's a kind of, it's like a feedback loop. The two things are, for me, constantly informing each other. Like when I showed that the development of lucid possession, I developed the screen first. I did a piece with Mari Kimura, the violinist, where we just did projections on the skirt. It was just a spoken word and music piece. And then I wrote like a couple of test scenes, and we added the screen, and I needed to have the whole system in place before I could write a script, because I felt if I wrote a script without having that engine in place, it would be it would be like a cinema script, and all the interactivity would be like rickrack around the edges. So there's this constant sort of like a feedback loop between thinking about the possibilities of what some kind of technology might be able to do, and then finding out what it can't do, and then thinking about a narrative, and then the narrative changes as I discover more about the technology. And right now I'm thinking about working. I've started out with the idea of doing something in the HoloLens, and now I think I and now I'm thinking about breaking it. I want to, like, I don't know, add laser point clouds, or maybe work on a tablet, or, you know, I'm feeling like a little itchy about the headset maybe, or, you know, so it starts, I've got this idea, it changes, there's always, I think there's this combination of fundraising, storytelling, and technology that all sort of, like, you know, weave back and forth in the early stages of a project, and include a certain amount of anxiety.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Could you say a little bit more about kind of what role the audience plays? Because I feel that you're interested in, you're doing things that are on a stage, right? That kind of are presented to the audience, or the audience looks at a screen, but it still kind of seems kind of fixed to kind of a reaction that is being read by the technology.
I've moved back and forth between performance and installation, essentially, and sometimes the two kind of collide in different ways. I'm interested in the way, you know, and the way interactive technologies have sort of turned viewers into performers, and vice versa. I'm interested in interactivity when there's a steeper learning curve and it really requires something more like a performer rather than somebody who's just walked in off the street into an installation. So I work back and forth between those two things. I think that there's something that happens with a live performance that where the performers are essentially human operators of this a kind of automaton, an engine, that is partially improvised and partially linear, where the audience feels that sense of improvisation, and there's an immediacy of something that's happening in real time. And I find that interesting. And then sometimes, one of the reasons that I've come back to installation is that I wanted to come back to having viewers have that more immediate experience of interactivity, of agency, basically. I think really what you're talking about is agency, because the piece itself, in that theatrical presentation, it's like watching a giant human-operated robot, really. And so the whole thing is kind of unfolding. I build human-operated machines that tell stories. So, that whole thing it's dynamic and it's alive and it's changing, and people know that in some sense. But that's a different experience than when you as an individual user have the direct agency to change something, which is what happens more within the installation work. But I'm interested in both, because there's a kind of complexity in the performance pieces. There's a kind of complexity that's almost like designing an instrument that is harder to do in a what I would call a dumb user installation format, which is a horrible way to talk about your audience. But in fact it's somebody walking in off the street who has no prior knowledge of how this works, and so it has to be. You want it to be an interface that's completely transparent. You want people to be able to learn it quickly, but you also want it to be continually rich and opening up in terms of content, so that you don't feel like the experience is over just because you figured out how it worked. So there's this whole sort of spectrum of possibilities in this whole field of work. That go where I get different kinds of satisfactions from the different kinds of pieces. It's a difference between, instrument building and individual agency.
I have a question on how you correlate the physical movements with like a certain mood or a certain piece of content, because I feel like there's a lot of decision making happening there from the programmer and maybe from you. So
in the nature of the gesture?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
The gestures are not specific in an iconic way. It's not like, this does, it's not like an alphabet or anything. It's more about a dynamic movement. And often when I'm performing it, like something that I could actually test kind of going like this will get blown up into something much bigger, so that the audience has a different, can experience it more directly. I think that what interests me about the motion sensing and about the way that works is, at first it seemed as if people were trying to control the character, let's say an artificial changeling. So you were trying to control the character. But then you couldn't always do it because it slips away from you all the time. It's like you're always reaching for it, but it's never quite there. It's always slipping away in some way. And I used to think that the holy grail would be, I go like this, she goes like that. But that turns out to be incredibly boring. It's because it's like having control of both sides of a conversation. So it slips away, it's there, it's gone, and people are constantly trying to get that connection back. And if they lose it, sometimes what I found is that they would be then mirroring what the character was doing. So in the same way that human beings do in conversation, where you'll see two people who are getting to know each other, and they'll, one person will go like this and the other person will go like this, or there's that mirroring of body movement. People started to do that with the screen, which I thought was really interesting. So I think what happens is that you try to control it, then sometimes you're controlling it, sometimes you're following it, and eventually the whole thing collapses into this feedback loop. So it's the act of motion and that feedback loop between you and the screen, that is this, it's like a flow, that it's like your body haunting the screen, you're connected, and it's a dynamic connection, kind of doubling that happens, that I find really fascinating. And I think it's one of the reasons that I've worked with some form of this kind of motion sensing for the last 20 years.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about the storytelling, because maybe also due to the presentation it came a bit short, like what inspires you first of all? And then also like how much room is there for improvisation, and like is it like a fixed story that is more or less like narrated over and over again, like in the very same manner as it is like scripted by you? And then yeah. Okay, maybe. Like
okay. Yeah, let me remember all of it. So, why don't I start with something like Spectropia, which is a kind of complete interactive narrative engine that has all these different kinds of possibilities. What happened as Luke and I performed it is that we started, the two of us, sort of refining our performance of it so that we ended up with something. It's never exactly the same. I'm interested in I think of sometimes the way narrative works in these pieces as if it was a wire running through a pile of sand, or a kind of cubistic, interface where you can come at things from all sorts of different angles, but the line of, the dynamic of the story might not change radically in some of the things that I've done. You could, in Spectropia, you could go through the whole thing seeing it completely out of one character's eyes or another character's eyes. You could change it radically. We didn't do it that much because we were chicken. Because you got comfortable with doing it a certain way, or you felt that might be the best way. I've found in installations that, other people would come in and do something with that installation. It was much more interesting than what I'd been doing, because I just got stuck in my own rut. I learned how to do it, and I learned how it did the thing that I kind of wanted it to do best, and then I'd start to kind of keep doing that. But the pieces themselves, I think they have within them the possibility of a phenomenal amount of improvisation and possibility, but they are somewhat linear. You could make them less linear if you chose. Like with Artificial Changelings, you could make it very narrative, or you can make it almost like an abstract physical dance experience. And I saw people doing both. So there's a lot of possibility in that way for it changing. But I also got interested eventually over time working with narrative systems in the idea that narrative is not just about choice or big changes or who gets the girl or having 6 different endings or having these big kind of changes. Sometimes the change is just like the surface of the water moving. It actually looks kind of the same all the time, except it's not. It's changing all the time. It's moving. And so it's like this thing is breathing, and it has a life of its own in some way, and that is being inhabited by the people who play it, whether they're viewers in an installation or in a stage piece. And that, I'm exploring different ways of kind of careening through stories and figuring out I'm always looking at different kinds of narrative strategies, but I'm still interested in being able to tell people a story. So I'm not interested in something like Muds or Moos where you're, basically my job would be to create set decoration for other people to create an improvisational theater piece in. And it's not that I think that's a bad thing. I think it's a fascinating thing. It's just not what I do. It's not what I'm interested in.
I just want to see, could you talk about how, for people that are especially for interactive pieces, like how that challenge, or talk more about how you deal with people sort of knowing how to sort of interact with a piece that comes in, either within Artificial Changelings or In Dress That Eat Souls, and what you, like the challenges that you have to sort of face to make sure that people are, one, understanding that they're interacting properly, or that, maybe not properly, but just that they're aware that they're
how to use it, how do you guide people, how do you make it apparent, how do you get a transparent interface that really functions where people aren't lost or they miss half
or that they
of
even
it.
know that they're doing it, that they're actually controlling it.
I mean, I've struggled with that. I think everybody struggles with that, over time, whenever you're doing something that's not standardized. So it's not like turning a page. It's not like everybody's seen, installations that have floor pads and, and motion sensing. It's just not around, It's gotten much easier than it was 15 years ago when people just didn't believe that it was actually happening. So now it's, people are sort of a little bit more sophisticated, but there are different things that work in different ways at different times. And the thing that I think in terms of being able to put an installation piece in a public space and walk away from it and feel that people could come in and pretty much use it, I think the dress is, because it's bossy, it just tells people what to do. I don't, if the people come for a studio visit, I just sit down and then, I'll try, every once in a while I'll try to inject something, but people are usually so gone they don't hear me. So, so she just takes over. I think there are different kinds of things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with spaces that aren't designed for what you do, and that is a problem that all of us probably have. I suspect a lot of you are people working with emerging technologies, and a museum was built for objects and things on the wall, and a movie theater was built to see movies in, and these architectures came out of a standardized form, and there is no standardized form here. So everything you do is you're dealing with the traffic patterns and the architectures and the funding apparatus and all the things that belong to whatever that universe, that presentation universe is. And so sometimes I find often that it's flawed, the presentation. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes, I realize after doing the dress at the Ringling that I need, like a little stand right near where people are standing that says the experience is 13 minutes, feel free to spend time on the whole piece, and have chairs on either side, benches right on either side so people can watch other people do it, so that people don't feel like, oh, I'm hogging it, I have to step out and then miss the experience. And I found, for instance, in 1998 when Artificial Changelings came out, it was easier to get people to do things for a half hour than it is now, which is interesting. 13 minutes worked okay. Did that kind of, some.
I was just thinking about how, okay, so it seems like you're really interested in this idea of like being doubled on the screen, and like this sense, at least in like your first work that you showed us, like the sense of like uncanniness that arises from that. And I'm just thinking about like now, like people are so used to seeing themselves like either like documenting their own lives or like, you know what I mean? And I feel
you think that's changed? Yeah, you think is it changing the way people?
Yeah, I was just wondering like what you've seen, like how people react to that, because like I feel like now like it's like much more easy for people to like recognize themselves like on the screen. Yeah. And like if that uncanniness.
Yeah, but I don't think what I'm doing is about people recognizing themselves so much. It's more about building relationships with a character or with an entity of some kind. And there still seems to be a kind of, I think early on it was a little harder. I keep remembering Luke at one point told me this story about Clara, who played the theremin for Theremin as he was developing. They would do concerts, and she said the first 5 years were hell. Everybody came with binoculars to see where the wires were, and nobody listened to the music. And he told me that story to make me feel better, because people kept telling us we should have like elaborate tutorials that told them exactly what was going on and how, and now it's gotten a little easier. I think it's just, but I don't feel like what I'm doing is familiar yet to people on the whole. So they might have a clue now, whereas they might not have before, but I don't feel like it's I don't feel like it's familiar yet. Even with all the games and, even with kids. Kids are, always faster. They usually get it. You don't have to explain interfaces to people that tall.
I have one question. Can you open to us any your future ideas for the projects?
Well, right now I'm starting to work on this piece that's based on two characters, one on Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher who was assassinated in 415 AD, and a character in the future named after Kepler who's working on solar sail technology. And it's about two people pushing back against a dark age, and it's kind of love story about going through the dark towards light. And I'm experimenting with augmented reality, and I'm not sure. I think probably I'm going to start by doing a bunch of like short stories, little bits, just testing some of these different platforms, and maybe work with a tablet or try the HoloLens. And I'm just looking at a lot of different things, sort of looking at projection mapping, tablet and HoloLens right now. And I'm also looking at Unity and gaming engines, which I haven't worked with before, and with AI-generated character development, and wondering how much a kind of a scripted, modeled information about a character's speech and agendas could be embedded in an AI, so that that character could be changed by both user interaction and events that it experienced. So that's something that I'm kind of fascinated with right now, is the idea of kind of emergent behaviors in a character model that is basically an AI. I guess I've been working with AI in a way for a while. It's not maybe technically AI.
Well, I also have a second question. It looks like you have very specific kind of stories first created before you actually create a piece. Like, for example, you just told about the next idea for the project.
Yeah.
How do you find inspiration for the stories, or where do you take these characters from, or if you have any collaborators on the projects for your stories?
I thought about, with the dress, I worked with Renee Stenke, who's a novelist, and that was the first time I'd ever worked with a writer, and she wrote a lot of the stories in the decades, the voices that you hear in your ear in the different decades of all the people who'd worn the dress. And that was really fascinating. I might work with her again on this. It was a really interesting kind of collaborative dynamic, and I really had fun with it. Usually I write my own stuff. And I start, like Hypatia just popped into my mind, and then I decided to, then I started looking her up. And she was assassinated by a mob of Christians in around the period of time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And so there were there's a number of obvious kind of similarities between that time and our time. And I just started to get interested and started poking around. And what happens whenever you do that, you look at something and you get a kind of a simplistic meta idea about something, and then it turns out to be bullshit, basically. And then but then you learn something else, and you start to construct something else. A lot of what I do, I do these time travel pieces, and I'm almost always I'm dealing with a character in the present or the future, and something in the past. And that moment in the past is telling me something about the present. So the birth of the artificial changelings was the birth of the department store, and the birth of different kinds of consumerism, and the beginnings of display culture and advertising and salesmanship. Spectropia was the beginnings of a shift in our relationship to credit and debt. The lucid possession was about how our identity gets fragmented, and how we're living with these sort of multiple layers of ourselves in these different kinds of spaces. I was interested in that, and how and how sometimes these social media spaces conflate or confuse ideas of, audience and community, performance and conversation, and how those things start to collapse. So they're all about, like, I don't know, they just, they show up, and then I start following them. Sometimes I feel like an archaeologist. Somebody kidded me at one point and said that I did these librarian thrillers because all my characters are like archaeologists or something. But that's what it feels like. Sometimes it feels like the narrative just exists somewhere, and you're just like blowing dust off it. You just find it, and then if you just kind of carefully dig, it will just kind of come out. It's sort of there somewhere.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions, but thank you so much for presenting your
It's a
brilliant
pleasure.
work and sharing your ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. Come and ask me questions if you want.